This episode includes discussion of torture, decomposition, restraint, and a prolonged violent death. Please take care of yourself while listening. There are some cases where the first warning sign isn't violence, it's silence. A missed call, a promise that goes unkept, a parent knowing deep down that something about the quiet doesn't feel normal. And sometimes that's how a story starts. Not with what the police find, but with the moment someone who knows you best realizes you've gone missing in a way that doesn't fit you. Because what makes certain cases linger isn't just about what happened, it's how quickly a life can shift from future and possibility into rumor, image, greed, and violence. And sometimes the most unsettling part is not what was real, it's what people believed was real. This is Murder in the Black. I'm Steph. Let's get into our true crime case for this week. Our case takes us to Riverdale, Georgia, in Clayton County. Clayco, where you at? Clayton County is one of those areas that feel transitional for a lot of young people. There are several tech colleges, community colleges, and colleges nearby. And for a lot of students, that stage of life is about trying to figure out where they're headed and what they want their future to look like. It's the kind of place where people are in between versions of themselves. Not teenagers anymore, but not fully settled into adulthood either. Trying things on, testing identities, figuring out how they want to be seen. And that matters here more than it might seem at first. On July 8, 2006, Clayton County Police Department received a call from a mother in California. Her name was Peggy Walker, and she was worried about her son, Carlnell Walker, who was attending Morehouse College in Atlanta while living in Riverdale. She hadn't heard from him, and that was unusual. And this wasn't just any random day to notice he was missing. It was Peggy's birthday. Carnell had promised to either call home or come visit, and when he did neither, she became concerned enough to ask police for a welfare check. That detail says a lot without needing much explanation. Some people just know when a break in routine means more than a break in routine. There's a difference between someone being busy and someone being absent in a way that doesn't feel like them, and Peggy felt that difference. Officers went to the residence, and what they found was horrific. The front door and the garage door were both closed, so they made their way around to the back of the house. The back door was open. As soon as they got close, they were hit with the smell of decomposition that shifts the entire temperature of a case immediately. Before that moment, this was just a welfare check. After that moment, everyone on scene understands they are likely stepping into something far worse. Inside the garage, they opened the trunk of the car and found a male inside wearing only boxer shorts. He had been there for a significant amount of time. His body was bloated. Based on the evidence, investigators believe Carnell's body may have been there for around 3 weeks, which meant he could have been dead since June 19th. And just to explain that briefly for you all, decomposition starts almost immediately after death. But what people usually hear about first are the visible changes, bloating, odor, and the body beginning to break down as bacteria and heat take over. In a case like this, where the body is enclosed in a trunk and exposed to Georgia heat, decomposition can be advanced. At the same time, because he wasn't exposed to animals or some outside elements, parts of that process were slowed or altered. So, in theory, the trunk kind of acted as this casket in a way to preserve some parts of the decomposition process. It was not open air exposure, but it also was not protection. It was confinement. Even though investigators strongly believed the victim was Carnell, they still had to confirm it. Fingerprints were taken, and the victim was identified, sadly, as 23-year-old Carlnell Walker, a student at Morehouse College. And once his name was confirmed, the case became even harder to understand. Carlnell Walker was a student at Morehouse. He was from Richmond, California, and by all accounts, he was fun loving and hardworking. He had goals. He wanted to start his own record label. His obituary also described him as a miracle baby, which tells you something about how deeply he was loved, even though public reporting does not really explain the story behind the phrase miracle baby. I don't want to dig into what's not there. But from the beginning, one of the hardest things for people who knew him to understand was how someone like him became a target. That's part of what gives a case like this an emotional center. Not just the violence, but the contradiction. The person people knew versus the way they were found. The future that seemed to be in front of them versus the brutality of what actually happened. As detectives continued examining the body, the case only became more disturbing. Carlnell's hands were bound with USB cords and electrical tape. It looked like some of his locks had been cut. Investigators also noticed stab wounds to his hands and thigh area, and they began to believe he had been tortured. The word torture is significant. Torture is not just violence. It implies time, restraint, control. It implies that somebody or multiple people have both the opportunity and the willingness to prolong his suffering. His body was sent to the medical examiners so the exact cause of death could be determined. Then detectives entered the house, and inside told a brutal story of its own. They found a pile of Carlnell's locks, most of them cut off. On the kitchen table, credit cards were sprawled out in the living room. Furniture was broken. In the hallway, picture frames had been knocked from the walls, and there was blood smeared on the walls as well. Investigators also found a bloody palm print, suggesting a violent struggle had taken place. In the bathroom, there was a bloody footprint on the toilet, making investigators think someone may have been standing on it. In the master bedroom, the room had been ransacked. The mattress had been moved and partially pulled off the bed. It looked like someone had been searching for something, and at the same time, violence had been carried out all over the house. Detectives believed there had likely been multiple perpetrators. They also found blue jeans covered in blood, along with a hammer covered in blood, both on the head of the hammer and on the handle itself. When you list out those details one by one, the scene doesn't read like panic. It reads like duration, like movement from room to room, escalation, more than one person making choices inside that home. Then they found paperwork that added another possible layer. There was a letter from an insurance company saying Carlnell had been involved in a car accident, and that claim was being processed. They also found two more letters. One threatened him over rent and told him to lock the house up. The second letter was typed. It was an eviction notice, neatly placed on the couch and signed by Terry Alexander. Police learned Terry Alexander lived across the street. He was also Carlnell's tennis coach at Morehouse College. As time went on, Carlnell built friendships. Things had apparently become more complicated because of the rental issues. That immediately made Terry someone detectives needed to understand better, the very least, needed to speak with. Because now he wasn't just a landlord, he was someone with overlapping roles in Carlnell's life: coach, mentor, landlord, and neighbor. And those overlapping relationships can complicate motive and perception very quickly. Terry came in for a formal interview and insisted he had nothing to do with Carlnell's murder. When police asked whether he had been by the house since June 19th or after, he claimed he had gone inside the residence to place the eviction notice on the couch. Detectives found that suspicious immediately. Because let's pause for a second. Police had just described a chaotic, destructive, dangerous scene. There was visible damage, blood, furniture broken, locks on the floor in a pile, clear signs something terrible happened. And Terry's explanation was that he saw all of that and simply stepped over it, placed the eviction notice neatly on the couch, and left. I know what some people would say. They'd say maybe he didn't want to be intrusive. Maybe he and Carlnell were already having issues. Maybe he just wanted to leave the notice and mind his business. But at the same time, let's face it, this was Terry's property. He had a vested interest in what was going on at the home. You would think he would at least look around. If nothing else, you might think that he might walk around the property and at least take pictures and document what he saw, bringing further proof that Carlnell no longer needed to be at his property outside of the fact he hadn't paid rent. This is one of those moments where a lot of you will say your instincts may split. Now, some of you may say staying out of what was going on in that house was the safest option. And others, like me, will say the scene described was so obviously wrong that walking away made no sense. That leads to the first question I want to ask you guys. If you walked into a house that looked like that, would you really leave without calling anyone? Or does that explanation sound off to you? Now, police pressed Terry further because it sounded off to them. When asked about the locks in the middle of the floor, he said he assumed Carlnell had cut them off himself because he had apparently suggested it before to him. And even that seems weird, right? You suggested that he cut his locks off, and so he cuts them off near the front of the door and leaves them in a pile? I mean, I don't know. That's weird. But detectives were not convinced, like me, that he was being forthright. After all, this wasn't just a landlord-renter situation. This was also someone who had become a friend, a coach, a mentor. So why did he seem so unconcerned, unbothered? That lack of concern stood out. Sometimes what investigators notice is not just what someone says, it's what they don't seem to be moved by. They asked Terry for his shoes so that they could compare them to the footprints they found in the bathroom and throughout the house. And when they tested those footprints, it didn't match. And little by little, detectives began moving him off the suspect list. His obvious motive would have been wanting Carlnell out of his house, but that still didn't explain why he would destroy his own property and leave a body in the garage for someone to eventually find. And that's often how early theories start to weaken. A person may have friction with the victim, they may seem suspicious, they may even behave strangely. But if the physical evidence keeps refusing to support the theory, detectives have to keep moving. Very quickly, investigators ran out of solid leads, so they turned to the media to try to generate more. And then a witness came forward, a woman who claimed she knew who killed Carlnell and why. Now, the informant wanted police protection because she feared retaliation. She did not want to provide a written statement, but detectives eventually talked her into coming down to the station. She said she and Carlnell had done some cleaning jobs together, going into homes to clean and then leaving and getting paid. During one of those jobs, Carlnell had been accused of stealing jewelry. According to her, the person who said the jewelry was taken had threatened to kill Carlnell and stuff his body into a trunk. She identified this man as Ari Brown. She said he was from New York and had ties to the mafia. This was why she was frightened to come in and believed that if he found out it was her, that he would kill her or have someone connected to the mafia kill her. This tip was difficult to ignore, not just because it named someone, but because it included a threat that eerily mirrored the way Carlnell was actually found. Police brought Ari in to speak with him. In the interview room, detectives noticed he was singing a rap about how police were out to get him. He almost immediately asked for a lawyer and refused to answer questions. Investigators searched Ari's loft and collected multiple pairs of shoes to compare against the footprints found in Carlnell's house. They checked his phone records, hoping a ping would place him in the area of Carlnell's house, but it didn't. They also couldn't prove he had actual mafia ties. In the end, detectives started to believe that much of what may have seemed dangerous about Ari Brown was just a persona. I want you to keep that word in mind as we navigate this case, because it's full of it. Persona, the version people present, the version other people believe, and the version that may have looked dangerous, wealthy, connected, or important from the outside. None of Ari's shoes matched the footprints in the house, and none of the DNA evidence tied him to the crime either. Once again, investigators were left with nothing that brought them much closer to justice. So once again, they went back to the media, hoping to find a witness. But they also checked social media. And in 2006, it wasn't Facebook or Instagram, it was MySpace. So they paid a visit to Carlnell's MySpace page. On there, he called himself C Money, the letter C dash money. He had built a flashy thug persona. He claimed he was making $75,000 to $100,000 being a DJ. He posted pictures of himself holding up money, but when detectives dug into reality, this wasn't true. Carlnell was a college student facing eviction, and when they checked his accounts, he had just $20. That contrast is a huge part of what makes this case so compelling and so painful. Because now investigators were not just looking at a homicide, they were looking at the gap between image and reality. Then detectives received a call from an attorney's office. The attorney said he knew about Carlnell Walker's accident and was actively working with him to resolve the incident. Months before Carlnell was murdered, Carlnell had sustained injuries and filed an insurance claim that tracked directly back to the insurance letter detectives found inside of his home. That claim was worth about $3,000. Carlnell, knowing the amount of the claim, had apparently started telling people he had around $3,000, maybe even more, even though the claim had not yet been resolved. And that may have been the motive behind the murder. That detail changes the emotional logic of the case because now the motive may not have been actual wealth, it may have been anticipated wealth. Promised wealth, talked about money, money that sounded real enough for desperate or envious people to move on, especially with him taking pictures of money and placing them on his MySpace. And that brings me to the second question. How often do you think people become targets not because of the truth of their lives, but because of the image other people build around them? That question sits at the center of this story for me because greed doesn't always need reality. Sometimes it only needs a convincing illusion. The medical examiner later confirmed what investigators had feared. Carlnell had been tortured. He had puncture wounds on his body, including to his hands, thighs, and hips. His locks had been cut off. He had bruising around his head and torso. The cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. Based on him being bound in the garage in the heat of Georgia and unable to breathe properly, he endured an excruciating death. That finding makes the cruelty of the case impossible to soften. This was not a robbery that spiraled in seconds. This was sustained. It was chosen repeatedly over hours. Detectives decided to take a creative step. They created a message on Carlnell's MySpace account, hoping it might bring out someone who knew more. And eventually, it did lead somewhere important. An employee at Morehouse Cafeteria came forward and told investigators there was someone by the name of Breylon Garland who came forward and told them a story. They claimed that Breylon called them up and asked to take a drive with them that night. Breylon said he had been there when Carlnell was killed and identified other students involved. Breylon was a psychology major and worked 3 jobs, one of them on campus, which is how he knew the cafeteria employee. By outward appearance, he seemed unassuming and had a good head on his shoulders, came from a great background. But like Carlnell, investigators began to see that Breylon also had a different persona online than what may have actually been true. He was also from California and apparently pretended to be involved in gang activity and tried to come off as tough. And honestly, that part makes sense in a broader way. A lot of young people go off to college in different states and reinvent themselves. Sometimes it's because they're insecure. Sometimes it's because they want to seem harder, richer, cooler, or more connected than what they actually are. In a new city, those personas can land because people don't know who you really are. They don't know your history. That's part of what makes college such a strange space socially. People are often building themselves up in public, trying on identity, sometimes harmlessly, sometimes recklessly, and sometimes in ways that draw in exactly the wrong audience. Police needed to verify the information they got about Breylon, so instead of rushing him in for an interview immediately, they started surveilling him. One night, they saw him walking, and the detective had his phone number. So he gets out his phone, he calls him, and he says that he knows that Breylon was involved in something sinister and he needs to speak with him. And Breylon looks up from where he's being surveilled and he says, "Is that you in the Crown Vic?" And the detective says yes. And he approaches him and they begin to speak, which implies that Breylon knows that he was being followed. He tells the detective that he's in fear for his life. He said if the others found out he was talking, they would kill him. Fear like that can mean a lot of things. Sometimes it means a person is telling the truth, and sometimes it means they know just enough to be dangerous to the others. And sometimes it means they are trying to position themselves as less involved than they actually were. They bring Braylon down to the police station and talk to him. He said he received a phone call from a fellow Morehouse student named Miles Allen, who wanted a ride. Seems harmless enough. Miles said he wanted to go to Carlnell's house, pick up some weed, and then smoke it there. On the way, they also picked up Keith Roberts, another Morehouse student, and another man by the name of Raheem, and Braylon claimed he didn't know his last name. When they got to Carlnell's house, Braylon said he saw Miles pick the lock to get inside of Carlnell's home. That was the moment he said he realized this wasn't a regular visit or an expected one. Once they were inside, Braylon said a plan was formed to jump Carlnell when he got home. According to him, Keith Roberts had an issue with Carlnell and he felt disrespected by him. He also heard that Carlnell was coming into a lot of money because of a car accident, and they wanted to rob him. The motive tracks with so much of what the investigation had been circling: the ransacked house, the searching, the obsession with money, the gap between what Carlnell really had and what other people thought he had. Braylon said he became nervous and wanted to leave. But when he saw a weapon in Keith Roberts' waistband, he became afraid he would be harmed too. So he stayed. Then they waited. And that waiting is one of the darkest parts of this entire story because it means there was time for everyone involved to reconsider, to leave, to understand where this was heading. But they stayed. When Carlnell came home, Braylon said Miles and Raheem attacked him, punching him and knocking him out. Braylon said they then dragged Carlnell to a chair, tied him up with cords. They interrogated him about the money they thought he had. They tortured him, doused him with flammable liquid, and beat him. Keith threatened to cut off his locks. Carlnell begged for his life and said he had no money. Keith then cut all of his locks off. According to Braylon, the torture continued for hours. He tried to present himself as mainly a witness, distancing himself from the violence, but eventually he admitted to police that he did participate in the beating. He also admitted to stabbing Carlnell in the hand, though he claimed he only participated because he feared for his own life. This is where Braylon's version becomes hard to take at face value. Because fear may explain part of the person's behavior, but it doesn't erase participation. And when someone admits they joined in the violence, even while trying to minimize it, detectives are going to hear that very differently than the speaker hopes they will. After hours of torture, Braylon said they put Carlnell in the trunk. He said that Carlnell was still screaming when they closed it and left. That detail is chilling. It means this was not an assumption that he was already dead. It means there was awareness that he wasn't. There was life. and yet they still chose to close the trunk and walk away. Breylon also claimed that he returned before daybreak, unlatched the trunk, and heard no movement. He said he reached in and touched Carlnell's leg, got scared because it was cold, and ran out the back door and left it open. Police believe Breylon was minimizing his own participation and pushing more culpability onto the others. And I understand why. Because even if he was not as central as the others, the harder truth is that there were several points he still had choices. When he initially left with the others and dropped them all off at their destination, he could have called the police. Before he even went back to the residence, he could have called the police and anonymously gave them a tip. When he ran out of the residence and realized that more than likely Carlnell was dead, he still could have called. My whole point in reiterating, there were so many choices that even Breylon had during this entire situation, even if you want to believe that he was scared and in fear of his life, he still had choices to call the police and he chose not to. Breylon Garland was arrested and taken into custody. Investigators then went to Morehouse and identified Miles Allen as a student. They began searching for him, but Miles turned himself in quickly once he realized the police were looking for him. Like Breylon, Miles tried to distance himself from the crime, but he had injuries on his body that linked him to the attack, like scratch marks on his hands. Investigators were also able to identify the palm print that was left in Carlnell's house, and it connected Miles to the crime because the blood found on that bloody hand palm print not only matched Miles, but it also had Carlnell's blood and Miles mixed together. Then they brought in Keith Roberts. At one point, he reportedly said it was God's will and that he would speak to God at sunrise. Investigators were able to connect Keith through DNA evidence found on the flammable lantern globe used during the torture. They also had a single fingerprint belonging to Keith Roberts. That kind of evidence matters so much in a case like this because by then, investigators were not just hearing stories, they were matching people to objects, surfaces, blood, to the mechanics of the crime itself. The last person they needed to locate was Raheem Muhammad, whose real name was Theodore Hallman. He had fled to Chicago and had a lengthy criminal record. With help from the U.S. Marshals, police picked him up and brought him back to Georgia. Theo gave a statement, and detectives finally had a working theory of what happened. According to investigators, the group broke into Carlnell's home. They viciously assaulted him, put him in a chair, bound him with wires, tortured him for hours, stabbed him, beat him with a hammer, and then they placed him in the trunk of the car, still restrained in high heat, where he endured a slow, painful death. By that point, the case had moved from confusion to confirmation, not because it made any more emotional sense, but because the evidence and statements had finally converged enough to show the structure of the crime. Theo pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Keith Roberts, Miles Allen, and Breylon Garland all took their chances at trial. Breylon Garland was acquitted on all counts, though, according to the district attorney, prosecutors believed he had been an active and calculated participant. Keith Roberts, who was also described as the mastermind, was sentenced to 2 life terms plus 10 years. Miles Allen was found guilty and sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 70 years in prison. And when you look back at this case, it's hard not to think about how close it may have come to never being solved at all. If not for the cafeteria worker who came forward with information about Breylon, investigators may never have got the break they needed. That kind of detail is significant because cases are often remembered for their endings, the arrest, the convictions, the sentences. But so many cases only get there because one person decided to say something. Carlnell's life was cut short over greed and jealousy. And when humiliation, pressure, and violence still didn't get the men what they wanted, they ultimately decided to take his life. Quick pause just in case you're locked in right now. I want to make sure that you're subscribed to Murder in the Black and you press that bell icon so that you can keep up on our updates. For exclusive episodes and subscriber only content, consider becoming a paid subscriber. Here's a little nugget. We have a 3-day free trial on Apple Podcasts just in case you want to figure out the lay of the land first before you commit. Storytime with Steph is back. That is where I present many true crime stories you won't always hear on our main feed, but the stories deserve to be told. And you can watch that on whatever social media platform you enjoy us on. But I especially want those of you who are on TikTok to know that I'm back. And this is where we started our Murder in the Black community. One more quick favor. Make sure you leave a 5-star rating and review if you enjoy the work here. Let's get back into our story. Takeaway. What stays with me in this case is how much of it seems to orbit perception. Not just greed by itself, but greed attached to an image. Jealousy attached to an idea, a performance of money, toughness, and status that may have looked real enough to the wrong people. Carlnell had a persona online. So did Breylon in his own way. Ari, according to police, may have had one too. And that's part of what makes this story feel bigger than one case. A lot of young people and adults build identities when they leave home. They exaggerate, they experiment, they perform confidence they don't really feel yet. They present a version of themselves they think people will respect, fear, admire, or want to be around. And most of the time, that doesn't end in violence, but sometimes it does create a dangerous gap between what is real and what other people believe is real. Because if someone thinks you have money, access, power, or status, they may act on that belief, whether it's true or not. And if that belief is mixed with resentment, insecurity, or jealousy, it can become combustible. That's what makes this case feel so tragic. Carlnell wasn't killed over proven wealth. He was killed, at least in part, over what people thought he had, what he said he had, what they felt entitled to take. And I think there's also a hard conversation here about how much we share and who's really watching. Not in a victim blaming way, never that, but in an honest way. Social media, image, persona, all of it can blur reality. People don't just see what you post, they project onto it. They compare themselves to it. They build stories around it. Sometimes they envy it. Sometimes they want to exploit it. That doesn't mean the answer is to become invisible. And it definitely does not mean responsibility belongs to the victim. But it does mean we should be honest about the fact that visibility is never interpreted only by people who love us. Some people watch with admiration. Some watch and compare. Others watch with hunger. And some watch while deciding what they believe. Some watch while deciding what they believe you owe them. Carlnell should have been able to dream big, post how he wanted to present himself, and move through college without that turning him into a target. That's what makes this so infuriating. A young man with goals, humor, personality, and plans for a future was tortured and killed because other people let greed, jealousy, and illusion become more important than his humanity. This case is about Carlnell, who he was, how he died, and how he suffered. But also, it becomes central to this idea that he was punished, in part for a story other people built around him. Lastly, I can't fully shake Breylon Garland's acquittal. And legally, acquittal is just that. But morally, I think some questions remain for me because this was someone studying psychology, someone who arguably understood perception, understood presentation, and how to narrate himself. And I've wondered whether telling his story first gave him an advantage. Because first narratives can shape how everyone interprets what follows. He positioned himself as frightened, as peripheral, as trapped, and maybe some of that was true. But there were also obvious signs of participation. By his own admission, his presence, silence while Carlnell suffered, and the fact that he did not act when action may have mattered. And I think that leaves a harder question lingering for you. Do you believe Breylon received mercy, or did he successfully distance himself from culpability by becoming the first storyteller? Those are not the same thing. And maybe an even harder question is, when does cooperation help expose a crime? And when can it become a shield for someone equally implicated? I don't know that this case resolves that clearly. And maybe it shouldn't. But sometimes what stays with us the most is not what a jury decided, but what feels unsettled after the verdict. Regardless, what I keep coming back to as we have reached the end of our episode is that Carlnell Walker did not deserve to die for any reason, but especially because of illusion. We've finished our episode, but we're taking the conversation live, y'all, tonight at 7:15 on Instagram and across our other platforms. So I hope you will join me because, as you can hear, this case is layered. There's a lot to unpack here, and the live is really an opportunity for us to keep the conversation going and connect in real time. So we'll be discussing this case, my thoughts, but more importantly, yours, because I always say some of the most interesting analysis happen in the community. And we won't just be talking about this case. We'll also be digging into our true crime and current news segment and some of the cases we've been following together, the David and Celeste case, the Ashley Janae case, and many more. So bring your questions, bring your theories, and come ready to talk. Kiki, get your wine, get your coffee, whatever you got, and let's talk about it. And one more thing I'm excited about. Next week, I have a special drop coming on our main platform, yes. But if you're a part of our paid subscription, you already know what I'm hinting towards. It's going to be a preview of our original true crime story that premieres May 10th. So if you've been hearing me hint at that subscriber series, next week you'll finally get a taste of what's coming. And the big tee is that we have a paid subscription free trial that we offer. So if you want to test out the waters and you like what you hear when you get that preview next week, go ahead and tap in on Apple Podcasts. That's how much I love y'all. I'll be looking out for you. I love you that much. I cannot wait to share this original true crime series with you. Been working on it for a minute, and I think you guys will love it as well. Do not forget, if you love our content, make sure you subscribe to us on YouTube. Hit that bell icon so you don't miss any new drops that we may have. You guys already know I'm in your face all week. You're going to get a story time with Steph every Wednesday on whatever platform you enjoy. And if you want to go deeper, then you can join us over on Substack, where I produce different articles where we do not simply reiterate what we've covered on the episode, but we find something inside of the episode that we can expand on together. Lastly, if you enjoy our content and what we do here on Murder in the Black, I always tell people the best way you can give me a thank you is by going to whatever platform you listen to us weekly on and giving us a 5-star rating. And if you really love us, give us a review as well. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black. I'll see you tonight.